Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My guest today, guest of our national press agency, is Professor Edward Dutton, known also as Jolly Heretic. He told me that he uses the title professor nowadays because it is a higher title than his PhD, or to be called a doctor. Dr. Edward Dutton, it's so nice to have you back again. You were my guest on my YouTube channel when I was still really obscure. Now I'm a little bit less obscure because mainstream media, they made a great deal out of my interview of Stefan Molyneux, and now I'm news in Slovenia.
Are you? Oh, good.
Yeah.
You're a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah, I'm still a small fish in a small pond, but now I can, at least they see me swimming.
You're a small fish in a small pond that's making waves.
Yeah, okay, that's correctly put. Dr. Dutton, a couple of days or a couple of weeks ago, you had a discussion with my friend and intellectual I cherish a lot, Dr. Tom Sunic, and you also spoke about self-censorship in academia. And this is a theme I would also like to talk to you. I remember when we did our first interview, you were still in Finland, and you told me how you came to Finland, that love brought you there. But nowadays you are professor of evolutionary psychology in Łódź in Poland.
Well, it's an honorary position. I just have to go there occasionally and do lectures. So no, I'm still in Finland. So I'm not in the free East. I'm still in the unfree West. At least for the time being, though my personal theory is that the light of civilization is gradually going to pass to the free East, because that's where the light of civilization generally passes, to places that have an optimum balance between group values and individual values. If you're too high in these group values and you're traditionally religious, there's certain things you can't question. There's a feeling of oppression. If you're too high in these individualistic values, then equality and harm avoidance or whatever are put above truth. And the balance has to be maintained between the two. And at the moment, that balance, I think, is being struck better in parts of the free East than in the unfree West.
Slovenia used to be very proud of the fact that we weren't as east as some other republics of ex-Yugoslavia, for example. We would always say and be proud of the fact that we weren't Balkans, that we weren't Eastern Europe. We would always say, no, we're not Eastern Europe, we're Middle Europe. We were... we came from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and so forth, but nowadays Slovenia seems to be becoming a little bit more skeptic about the so-called West.
I think that's a very good thing, because I mean, in times of old, there was some degree of shame associated with being Eastern. And until the Second World War, Finland was often classified, because it was an ex-Russian colony, as Eastern, and it was classified in the same breath as Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. They talk about it in the same breath as those. And then after the war, it very strongly pushed to be regarded as Nordic. But then it's between East and West, because it wanted to, first of all, it's between East and West, because it wanted to get on with the Soviets as well as getting on with the West. And then there's been this big idea of westernizing it. When my father-in-law was brought up in the 50s, they kind of saw themselves as much more Eastern than they do now. There was a shame associated with it. And I think that's going to go as you people in the East realize that it is better to be in the East. And I think that what you will see is more and more intelligent people or educated people fleeing to the East, just like you saw, I don't know, in the last time we had a winter of the civilization in the West, and that we had the whole Anglo-Saxon nobility fleeing to Byzantium. and you had Byzantium was where civilization was preserved in the East, while where the West collapsed into low IQ chaos. And perhaps one could even say extreme individualism with a religion based around individualistic values. You had the preservation of civilization in the East, and I think this is perhaps happening again. I mean, I am an example of a person that's been given this honorary professorship at a Polish Institute of Higher Education. In a sense, of an academic refugee from the unfree East, where I've in the unfree West. Sorry, in the unfree West, I've had my publicly condemned by early university. I have my name removed from the list of docents on the website. They can't move the title, so they remove my name from the website. And then I was offered this honorary position by a university in the unfree East, where truth is within certain boundaries still, but not within the same stricture of boundaries as the West. Truth is still more important than an ideology. So I think that I'm glad that Slovenia is beginning to think that way, and hopefully others will follow.
Yeah, although Slovenia is really torn apart. We're 50-50 communists and 50%, I don't know, nationalists, Democrats, sovereignists, you name it. And currently we have this centric government which is being led by Janez Janša, which is the lead of SDS, which is a party, social democratic party, which would not be considered right-wing in by any standards 10 years ago. And they're being called right-wing extremists and so forth. And the communists from Slovenia have been sending messages to Brussels that there's been problems in Slovenia with media, as in the government.
Isn't that a fascinating indictment of the change that has happened? Yeah. So when I was a boy in the 1980s, it was the Free West and the Communist East, and you had communist traitors in Western countries like Philby and these spies that passed messages to the Soviet Union and defected to the Soviet Union, and now it is the communists within the East who are the traitors who are aligned with the West. And so doesn't that just show you that it's completely flipped over, and that we are now living in what communism can become in a society? This is the other problem, is that there's the research I've looked at on race differences and ethnocentrism indicates that people that are Eastern European, and there may even be genetic reasons for this, are higher in negative ethnocentrism than Europeans. So they're more inclined to not like foreigners, whatever. They're higher in conservatism. Mm-hmm. And they're lower in positive ethnocentrism, which means that they're less trusting, they're less cooperative. And so if you apply something like communism to people that are highly, highly cooperative, highly inclined to trust their leaders, highly inclined to want to conform, and are highly open to new things, including foreigners and whatever, are very high in guilt, and all this sort of thing, very, very high in these sort of leftist values, then if they have that and there's a certain degree of ethnocentrism, then that's great, because you have this sort of strategy of genius where you're open to outsiders, and therefore you can trade and you can expand and you can learn things and you can produce more geniuses and whatever, and rule the world. But if the level of ethnocentrism, of the negative ethnocentrism drops too low, and positive drops too low, then this can be turned against you in a sort of self-hating new Gnostic heresy that says that you're absolutely terrible people and you're very bad people, and it's kind of the will of God or the will of the gods or something, that you should destroy yourself. And our level of traditional religiousness has dropped that low. And if this happened to other places, if this happened to places perhaps in Southern Europe, well, that wouldn't matter, because they'd still be relatively high in negative ethnocentrism, and they would be low in positive ethnocentrism, and so they wouldn't be as easily inculcatable by those that were pushing new ideas and things like that. But we are, and so it's completely destroying us. And so that's an interesting turn of events. Yeah,
Slovenia has always been considered a little bit more liberal than other parts of ex-Yugoslavia. For example, more open towards the West, um, and it seems to show. It seems to show it, and it seems to correlate with everything you just said. We, besides the fact that we were always considered a little bit more liberal than other countries from the ex-Yugoslavia, we were also always considered to be less ethnocentric, less aware of our own national and ethnic identity, and some of us, plenty of us, even ashamed of nationalism. It's always been, since I can remember, it's been a pejorative to call yourself a nationalist in Slovenia, for example.
And is that changing?
It's it's 50-50. Okay, it's not 50. Yeah, it could be changing, but even the so-called patriots, the people that would call themselves to love our country and so forth, the right-wingers, the Democrats and so forth, even they would be afraid to call themselves nationalists. In our country, to call yourself a nationalist, it's always been a pejorative. Even the patriots don't call themselves nationalists because they're afraid to be called national socialists or Nazis.
That's odd, because there doesn't seem to be a problem with being called a nationalist in the Baltic states or in Poland even, or in Hungary.
Yeah.
So why is that generally the case in the former Yugoslavia? Is that the case in Croatia as well and places like that?
Yeah, it could be that it is the case in Croatia also because of their Ustaše / collaboration with National Socialist history. At least this is how communists taught us history in ex-Yugoslavia. Perhaps I should tell about my story a couple of days ago. I had Stefan Molyneux on, and of course I've been called a fascist plenty of times from the left, from academia. Even my ex-professors called me fascist, and media. And so I made a joke in the beginning of the interview. I said, yeah, we're the new Slovene fascist media platform. And I didn't stop being serious, because this is how you tell a joke. You don't stop being serious. You don't do this or whatever. You just tell a joke and people have to understand it. And everybody with common sense saw that I was joking and so forth, but the whole hell got loose. Media got hysterical. Politicians from the left got hysterical. They even started threatening me with concentration camps. And this is, it's crazy here in Slovenia right now.
Oh, I didn't know that. I assumed. I'm interested to learn that. I assumed that Slovenia was based like Poland and like these kinds of places, and Hungary. I didn't know that Slovenia was following a different path. That's rather concerning. I know you've adopted the euro. And adopting the euro is generally a sign that things are going very well economically, and things going well economically will lead to people becoming decadent and whatever. And so that's also something to be concerned about. But I've not personally been there, and so I've never had any. I've no idea what's. I've been to Croatia, as I told you when we last met, but I've not been to Slovenia. So I've no. That's slightly concerning. But anyway. Hopefully, as the West descends into more and more chaos, you will either have to decide whether you Slovenians, whether you want to continue the light of civilization, as I think other Eastern European countries are going to end up doing, or fall into decadence, despair, nihilism, and whatever. And that's a decision that you're going to have to make. and it will start to become a problem when the generation now that's lived in the 70s, that lived under repression properly, when they start to retire, and you'll get this generation that's never known serious repression, that's never been told all the stories of how awful it was, and it will be sort of decadent and whatever. And then who knows what will happen? Because that's what seemed to happen in the West. There was a real change round about 2010. When the generation that fought in the war, that had lived before the war, that had really, suffered a hard life, suddenly they all were dead, and then it's just people that have never suffered that are in charge. Someone in the chat is saying that East Germany was based. Well, I'm told it still is, yes, as well. I've in there either. So anyway, so what was it you wanted to discuss then today?
Yeah, this is basically what I wanted to discuss. When this happened, this whole story with media, academia, with left-wing media, of course, it also happened that even the right-wingers, the so-called conservatives, they acted as if I didn't joke, and everybody denounced me and so forth. And now I have this situation in Slovenia where politicians and political thinkers and political analysts that would previously all wouldn't have any problems to cooperate with me, to give me interviews and so forth. Now they're all afraid of giving me interviews and cooperating with me. And what I wanted to ask you is, how did you cope with your situation back then in Britain? Okay, you got away. You got away to Finland and Poland now.
I don't know that I've ever really had a particularly severe situation. I have had with the Jolly Heretic a couple of instances of people that have said to me, the people that are in work, the people that work for British universities, that have said to me, I'd love to go on your channel. I really would like to be interviewed, but I just think I think 3 cases of this, but I don't want to upset them at the moment. It would have been all right before BLM, but now I'm not so sure. There was one case of a female academic who is a sort of part-time academic and part-time other things, and she was told by one of her employers that if she went on my shows, she would be fired. She was perfectly willing to go on and quite liked the idea, but then just at the last minute, she was asked by them, "What are you going to do this week?" And she said she was going to come on here on my show, and then she said, "Well, if you go on there, we don't want to work with you anymore." So it's obviously known about. It's been highlighted by Hope Not Hate, which is this anti-democratic organisation in the UK, ironically named because they are the most hateful people one could possibly think of, and hate and despise anyone that disagrees with them on any topic whatsoever. So that's the only evidence that I've had of it. I've had of anything like that. So, but otherwise, no, I've not had some public. I suppose there was an instance. It wasn't to do with the channel, but it was that a book that I wrote called "The Silent Rape Epidemic: How the Finns Were Groomed to Love Their Abusers," and this was reported on in a newspaper called Suomen Uutiset, which is the newspaper connected to True Finns, which is by a small margin the 3rd largest party in this country. It's almost the 2nd largest party in the country. And because the levels of trust and whatever are breaking down, even though Finland's this hyper-trust society, but now with multiculturalism and whatever, the levels of trust are breaking down here in a way that 15 years ago you wouldn't have dreamed of. And so there is this movement, delayed, but as with Britain or whatever, away from mainstream media and towards these alternative media. And one of the more popular ones is the newspaper of this political party, Perussuomalaiset, True Finns. And so this article in which I showed looked at why Finland adopted multiculturalism and various questions. I showed they were the most intelligent people in Europe and these kind of things. This caused a huge furore among leftists here in Finland, and the University of Oulu had to go out on Twitter and say that I don't work for them, I'm merely affiliated to them, and basically they'd remove that affiliation if they could, but they can't by law because it's for life. It's like a habilitation. and then they subtly there's a list of docents on what they call docenti on their website, and they just removed my name to avoid people finding me on there and moaning at them about it. So that was the nearest thing I had to being cancelled. Obviously, it's nothing like what happened to someone like Noah Carl, who was working full time at the University of Cambridge and was sacked in grossly unfair circumstances. And there's now been some kind of legal agreement, and he's not at liberty to say what's happened. It's the nature of these devious, duplicitous legal agreements that can't be publicly discussed what's gone on behind the scenes, and various other cases that have gone on like that. So in a very minor way, I suppose I've been sort of semi cancelled, but there's certainly been nothing like a huge thing about that. There was a case with me where my colleague Richard Lynn, who basically, I mean, he's a very elderly man, and you can imagine what the mind of a very elderly man is like, made a serious mistake in a paper we did, and consequently he was accused of plagiarism. And because my name was on the paper and I was in Finland, they did me for plagiarism and found me guilty. The university found me guilty of plagiarism, even though it was clear that it was his fault and he admitted it. And so I think that was just a signal that was being sent to me by the leftists in charge of this university. Look, we're out for you. We can do this to you, and we will. And that was in the newspapers. So yeah, those are my two experiences. But normally, I think these things die down. So if you've just been in the paper and it's a recent thing, then it'll gradually die. It'll eventually die down, and people will become less sheepish.
But why would, for example, why would they do that? What's the mentality? What's the thinking model behind it? Is it the IQ? Is it the money? Is it the you're not even an explicit right winger or
I think I'm a fairly explicit right winger. I mean, one model is that we live in a. I mean, if you look at Peter Turkin, the Russian researcher, he looks at this climatodynamic modeling, and he shows there are these various things which cause a society to be polarized, and societies go through periods of intense polarization. And there are a number of factors which over 10 years ago were causing him to predict that we would now be in a situation of intense polarization. One of those is immigration. If you have immigration, then you have this reduces wages for the poor. And so you have conflict and polarization because of that. So high immigration. Another one is the overproduction of elites. So if you produce too many people that have degrees or whatever, then you have all of these people who are basically elites or aspirant elites who want positions in the elite, but there's only a limited number of places in the elite. And so this leads to, if you think that there's 650 members of parliament in Britain, and currently 50% of people have a degree. In 1800 or 1890, there were 650 members of parliament, and 1% of people had a degree. So you can see the problem there. When my parents were a bit younger than me, 10% of the population has a degree. So this creates this intense conflict for these elite positions, and the result of that is that people will fight each other for these elite positions, and they will grab onto anything to try and push someone out of the competition in order to get the position themselves. And so if you've got someone who you see as a competitor for some place in some kind of elite position, some kind of status, then you will do everything you can to destroy them in a way that you wouldn't do if there was less polarization. You'd be much more tolerant of people having different opinions. It's, well, you know, like the 90s or whatever, people were much more tolerant of people having different opinions from them, because there wasn't this elite overproduction, which began really in the 90s, hadn't borne fruit yet, but now it has borne fruit. So I think that's one reason. A second reason is that we are increasingly a society of that is low in trust. And that means because of immigration and because of higher genetic diversity, even within the white population, due to weaker selection pressures and things like this. And so, therefore, if someone is different from you, then which they are, if they're right wing and you're left wing, they're different from you genetically. Then you want to remove them. You want to damage them. You're basically at the evolutionary level in a fight with them for limited resources. And so, therefore, you would want to damage your opponents. The third thing, I think, is a religious question. We've had this runaway individualism. This creates a new religion, basically. That religion is based around these dogmas that make the world make sense, of individualism, of equality and harm avoidance and whatever being more important than anything. And those who question that are therefore a problem. They're a problem for those who are financially invested in those dogmas being true, and they're a problem for those who are emotionally invested in it, people that are sort of mentally unstable. It's been shown that left-wing people are more mentally unstable than right-wing people. This means that they require sort of certainty more, and black and white certainty, and they get very upset if their ideas are questioned, and because it sort of confronts them with the void that is at their heart, and therefore you get this sort of, and often those kinds of people that want power, they're high in, it's been shown as well, people that virtue signal, leftists, are high in Machiavellianism and high in narcissistic traits. They want power and they want people to love them and think they're brilliant. That's why they virtue signal. And those people can have a sort of narcissistic rage against those that show them up to be the liars that they are. And so I was, of course, doing that. My research was fundamentally challenging the multicultural ideology in which these people believe with a kind of religious fervor. They have convinced themselves they believe it. They've realized that's the way the wind's blowing. A tipping point of individualism was reached in Finland, I don't know where, about 2010, I suppose. The whole elite flipped over to being individualistic. You then virtue signal more individualism to get status. You convince yourself of its veracity. You become financially and emotionally tied up in it, and then someone challenges it and therefore challenges you, and therefore you want to, they're competing for status, you want to take them down. And I think an element of it is also just being foreign. That I'm a foreigner in the country, and I was highlighting things. Leftists. Someone's written on the screen. Leftists have a low interest in truth. There was some research on that. The leftists are more dogmatic than right-wing people. They're more dogmatic. They're more likely to hold to their dogmas than are right-wing people. And I guess this could be because left-wing is overall, there's variations and subtleties and whatever, but overall it's more associated with neuroticism, with anxiety, with things like that. And one of the ways you allay anxiety is by creating an ordered black and white structure of your world, and therefore by being dogmatic. So I think that's what you're dealing with these. They're high in neuroticism. They're like children. They're compared to right-wing people who are like adults. The Monty Python did this comedy sketch once, which was satirizing the British general election coverage, and it did the sensible party versus the silly party, and it was perfectly obvious the sensible party was meant to be the Conservatives. Sensible policies, high in group-oriented values and high in individualism values. And the silly party was Labour, high in individualism values. And then they said, "Oh, and there was this election, this constituency will be interesting because there is a breakaway, very silly party which may split the silly vote." And I think that's really the essence of politics. That people that are conservative, they have these moral foundations that Jonathan Haidt is talking about, the group-oriented values that you need to be a successful pack. Of sanctity, of obedience to authority and structure, and of in-group loyalty. And then you have the individualistic values of harm avoidance and equality. And a balance between those is what's needed to create an optimum society. And the right seem to be about the same in all five. Whereas the left are basically less sophisticated. They're low, very low in the group values and very high in the individualistic values. And so they just come in and do all kinds of emotional, childish stuff, and then create an evolutionary mismatch where everything's ballsed up, and eventually the right come back in to clean up the mess. The problem, of course, happens when it is people that come in who are on the extreme right, and those people are very low in the individualizing values, so low in them that they end up taking us to another kind of chaos, to war, or and then, of course. It's their extreme as well, and so then the left come back in, and this seems to be the balance throughout history.
Is it sometimes inevitable that the left's hysteria produces extreme right-wingism and thus war, or can it be?
I don't know. I don't know if it's inevitable, but I think if it's cut down and stopped at a certain point, then I suppose it's not inevitable. But if you get runaway individualism, then eventually what you're going, which is what we've got now, because we used to have group selection pressures. If a group was too individualistic, then the result of that was there would be a war, and the group that was too individualistic would just be killed off. I mean, what, a third of the population of Germany was killed in the 30 Years' War. That was group selection in action, and that's probably why the Germans are so ordered and obedient and whatever, today. It's cooperative, but also aggressive, because that's what gets selected for in circumstances like that. And I think that the problem is that right-wing people can empathize with left-wing people because they share those individualistic values, but left-wing people can't empathize with right-wing people. And not only that, they are higher in moral disgust and they're more dogmatic. And so what that means is that everything's always going to be pushed in a left-wing direction, more and more and more and more and more, until it creates such dysphoria, until people are so full of disgust and anxiety over chaos and whatever all the time, that you'll then get a big backlash, and that backlash will often then go too far. It will be too extreme. It will be like the difference between left-wing Chile and then Pinochet, like that.
Yeah.
And that's often what will happen. The pendulum will swing back. So if you think about, you had leftist chaos in Britain in the 70s, then you had Mrs. Thatcher, who was the country became much more right-wing in a number of ways, and was considered uncaring and all this. And then under Blair, there was this huge swing back towards everything to do with emotion, and it's okay to cry if you're a man, and all this stuff. And I think that's kind of, in many ways, although there was a bit of a kickback with the Conservatives being elected, I think that's just kind of kept going. And it's just kept being more and more and more individualistic since then. And gradually you've got people expressing discontent in the form of Brexit, in the form of giving the Conservatives a large majority. But the thing is that the kickback to Labour in 97 was so huge, they had so much power, that they were able to completely infiltrate all of the organs of state. They were able to engage in a Gramscian cultural revolution. And so there's these groups in the society, the left in the society, that are so powerful in everywhere, in the police, in the legal system, in the schools, of course, in the churches, that it's very hard for the government to, even if they are right wing, and therefore what it'll take is something very extreme for this to be undone.
What I wanted to ask you is, are these traits, psychological traits you've been talking about, and referring also to Jonathan Haidt, are these historically contingent traits? Could it be possible that it's been different, 100 years ago, in the sense that, because when you've been talking about the left being less tolerant, more dogmatic, I remember that mainstream media and also school and so forth. When I was younger, I often heard about conservative people, about church-going people, about religious people who are part of conservative milieu, if I may say this, that they were more dogmatic. Was this just a lie, or was it true back then?
I think that's a very good point. So the research that I've read on this by Jonathan Haidt, I was thinking about this last night, actually. The research that I've read on this by Jonathan Haidt indicates that you've got these individualizing values. They're associated with the left. And you've got these group values, and they're associated with the right. And I think that's probably always the case. That but underneath those foundations are built up of like sub foundations, if you like, in the same way that the personality trait agreeable is built up of sub traits like caring or love or whatever. And so one of these is moral disgust. And another one of these would be dogmatism. And I think you're right. I think those might be historically contingent, because what you seem to get at any given time is is that people, particularly if they're perhaps a little bit more intelligent, they will notice what the dominant set of values is, whether it's group-oriented values like it is under, religion, traditional religion, or whether it's individualizing values where you signal about equality or whatever, like you do at the moment. They will better understand that. They will better absorb it. They will better realize the social benefits of accepting it, and they will force themselves to believe it, and then they will signal competitively the degree to which they believe it in this kind of competitive show of virtue signaling. And that virtue signaling in a broadly conservative society can be expected to be signaling group things like bravery, things like loyalty to the group, things like that sort of thing. Whereas in an individualistic society, you would expect to signal individualism. You would signal how by giving your child a very unusual name, let's say, is signaling. Whereas the other way, giving your child a traditional name is signaling traditionalism. And I wouldn't be, and you're obviously going to be better at it if you're more dogmatic and if you'll have higher levels of moral disgust. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's historically contingent. So that those traits. So the psychology of the church lady of Victorian England, that if that person was transplanted into England of 2021, they would be woke, extreme left, dyeing their hair purple. So I think that might be right. Yeah, I don't think it's inherent in left or right to be dogmatic. I think that's a matter of who has the position of power at the time. And if you're Machiavellian and narcissistic, then you'll be attracted to that. So the thing that has power and prestige at the time. Whereas if you're psychopathic, then you'll be attracted to chaos and whatever, and therefore to being a dissident. There was some interesting research that was published a few months ago, which showed that the narcissism and Machiavellianism is associated with being a left-wing signaler, left-wing, whereas psychopathology is associated with being far right. I wouldn't be at all surprised if those were reversed in Victorian England, if it was reversed. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. Would you say... you mentioned Monty Python before. Would you say that was a left-wing humor? And if it was, would it mean that was an era when left-wingers had much more of a sense of a humor than right-wingers had back then, but it is different nowadays?
Yeah, I think there, I did a video on this. I think that there is an extent to which humor is dissident, in the sense that people that are Machiavellian or whatever, or neurotic, they like order and structure, and there's an extent, and that's why they have no sense of humor, because humor is disorder. Humor is a loss of control. It's a physical loss of control. So it is inherently disorder, and in that sense, it's dangerous. And there's nothing worse for those who are in positions of power. It kind of illustrates the hole in your power, if you like, that people dare to laugh at you, which is why jokes can be dangerous, and it's why jokes are, I think, one of the best ways of confronting these people. And I think that what you had at the time of Monty Python was it was on the wane. You had it in the 50s, let's say, a broadly conservative society that was sufficiently religious that you, and not dictatorial exactly, but that you were careful what you made fun of. And by the 60s, that was changing, that was falling, and people were mocking it quite openly. But it was still considered to be that it was the conservative society was still dominant, and the individualism religion was kind of rising up. And we have a kind of lag where people still think now that you're being terribly witty and funny, making fun of the church or making fun of the Conservative Party or making fun of the nobility. But of course you're not. They've lost power. But there was a generation, I think, that were brought up, let's say they were born in the 20s, and they were brought up under that system being quite tight. And as they grew up, it liberalized, and they were able to make fun of it. And they've been brought up with these fundamental religious notions of truth and honesty and stuff like this. And they were this generation where they could make fun of it, and they did so quite brilliantly. And then it moved from that to a generation where they weren't really in power anymore. The conservative people weren't. Were they in power? Were they not? It's not clear. Like in the 90s. And those kinds of people would still, in a quite nasty way by then, make fun of the traditional society, but they would do so to attain status. They would do so because it was in the new up-and-coming society a way of getting status. And what we have now is we have these comedians that are still making fun of that society, and they are no longer, that society is gone, that society is finished. And it's just, they just want power. And it's just a way of gaining power. It's like laughing at people that don't have power. And that's in some ways, perhaps that's quite similar. If we're going to make a comparison to the humor of the 60s, that's perhaps a little bit similar to the kind of comedy where you make fun of the blacks, where from a position of power, the conservative, racist, whatever society, you make fun of black people. Aren't they funny? And that's the kind of humor that we have now that's dominant. But also we have less freedom now. So we had, I think, this situation in maybe the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was waning, where one set of religious beliefs, this group-oriented system, was declining, and another, individualism, was rising. And there was a period of freedom where you could poke fun at mainly at conservatives, but you could also poke fun at the individualists. I mean, that's what Monty Python did as well. I mean, they are making fun of traditional religious people in Monty Python, but they're also making fun. They're also clearly making fun of the far left, and even predicting who were powerful in the trade unions and whatever at the time, and predicting things like transsexuality and all this right at the beginning of Life of Brian. And so I'm predicting runaway individualism. We're all individuals. Yes, we are all individuals. I'm not. But now the religiosity of the individualism has risen to such an extent that you're not free anymore. But the genuine humor, the real stuff, challenging, that's dissonant. It's also dangerous. It's like making jokes about those in power in a sort of semi-dictatorship. It comes from the right, and it's like Tatiana McGrath and the meme culture and all this on Twitter and all this, and that's where the real stuff that's genuinely funny and cutting comes from, and it's suppressed. It's removed. You don't get stuff like that on television because the organs of power are leftist and they're in control of it, and they have no sense of humor, just like under a communist regime.
There was an interesting question. Would Ed write a book on progressivism as a religion? I think that was the question.
Well, Ed is currently writing a book on progressivism as a religion, and it should be out by the end of the year. So the answer is yes. It's been written.
Okay. What do you think about this transition or process? Rationalist / debunking blogs, libertarianism, neo-reaction / identitarianism is the white 21st century man pipeline.
I think that's a not unreasonable summary of what often goes on. I can certainly, in my own development, I can say that I have moved from being a conservative of the Thatcherite mold when I was a teenager to being much more of a group-oriented conservative or whatever, high Tory these days. And I know a lot of people where it's very similar, where you realise that the libertarianism, though it's a wonderful idea in theory, it only operates with any degree of usefulness in a society that is mono-ethnic and in which there are high levels of trust, really. And once you don't have that, once you have group selection and whatever, and once you have low levels of trust, then libertarianism doesn't work. All that will happen is you'll be dominated by the more group selected social group and by the more fervent social group. And so libertarianism, and it just doesn't work as an idea. You have to look after that. Being a rugged individualist doesn't work. You have to look, because to be a rugged individualist, to be, let's say, a scientist, a genius type scientist, you need to have a certain degree of security. You need to have the enemies at the gate kept away. And therefore, you need to have people that are prepared to lay down their lives for the society, to maintain the society, people who are group oriented, so that these genius types or these people that believe in libertarianism can come up with brilliant ideas that might offend people and whatever, and do their thing. So there needs to be this optimum level of positive and negative ethnocentrism, really, of group values. If it goes too high, then you just stagnate and nobody can question anything. It's like Japan. Nobody can question anything. Nobody comes up with new ideas. There's no genius and there's no science. But if it goes too low, then you balkanize and you end up with warfare and runaway individualism and the suppression of genius. And, again, so ironically, to maintain these types that will often be libertarian, the sort of genius type, what he cares about is himself and his own work and solving his problems and coming up with brilliant ideas or doing his art or whatever. If you're like that, to maintain that, you need to have an optimum low level of groupishness in the society. If it gets too low, as it has done in Britain, then the society gets invaded, society balkanizes, the society fetishizes individualism as a new religion and tells you can't question certain things. And it's just as bad, if not worse, than being in a highly group-oriented society.
Okay, before I ask you this question, I wanted to ask you another one about liberalism and communism. Americans call leftists or left-wingers liberals oftentimes. And you have this, then when you come into this libertarian phase, then you get to know about the distinction between classical liberalism and social liberalism. And what those liberals in America are under this distinction, basically social liberals and so forth. Have you been studying, are there any correlations between those left-wingers that call themselves liberals nowadays, that identify as liberals nowadays, and communists of the past?
Are there any points of commonality? What do you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think that you've got, if you compare in English terms the liberal to the conservative, the liberal is more concerned about things like equality and harm avoidance. And so that is so what the communist does is takes that to an extreme, where you fetishize equality, where you fetishize the lowest of the lows and hold them up as like the worker, and you hold them up as the highest of the high. So it's basically taking certain instincts that are within liberalism to an extreme. Similarly, the conservative will tend to be more inclined towards these group-oriented values, traditionalism, and what you have with fascism is taking those to an extreme whereby the individual doesn't matter at all. Or rather not the individual, but these individualistic values of harm avoidance and certainly of equality. Well, there shouldn't be equality at all. There should be no attempt at equality. Equality is a bad thing. You get that in some kinds of fascism, but not others. So in some kinds of nationalism, it's a kind of a coming together of the nation. We're all equal as Germans or whatever. But then in that context, there's not much of a concern about harm avoidance. We're happy to just sort of send people into battle and kill the enemy. So there's all kinds of crossover with them, but there are certain points that are approximately related. Yeah.
Okay. 3 questions. Ask Edward, what is the root cause of the Dutch/English cultural individualism compared to more collectivistic authoritarian?
Very difficult question. I've got Richard Duchesne's on my show on tomorrow, where I intend to discuss exactly this. My theory is that England is a sort of Goldilocks zone of where if you're further north, then the selection pressures are so strong that you have to have a very small gene pool, and that very small gene pool means that you can't produce geniuses, because the flip side of a genius is the outlier high IQ antisocial person. The flip side is the low IQ antisocial person, i.e. the criminal type, or the high IQ dreamer sponger. And they're no good in a society that's that up against it, where the gene pool is small and they don't, like Finland or whatever, and they don't produce people like that, or indeed the Northeast Asia. And then the further south than that, intelligence is the pressure to select for very high intelligence is not as high. The IQ is lower as you go because the selection pressure, cold, whatever, is less intense, and there is less selection pressure to be open so people are more negatively ethnocentric, more conservative. They're less open to new things. And what you have in this Goldilocks zone, what I call a genius strategy, whereby you have a gene pool that is large enough to produce people with outlier high IQ, which you could also have in the South, plus these psychopathic sort of traits, which you could also have in the South, but plus this openness. And the outlier IQ is more likely in the middle, and therefore you this makes you open to new ideas. You're open to trading. You expand. Your population expands. You produce more geniuses because of your higher gene pool, and expands more and expands more. And that's my sort of model of it. I call it the genius strategy. And Britain and perhaps Holland seems to be the optimum place for that strategy. Another model is what's been proposed by Richard Duchenne and Kevin McDonnell, and that is that it's something to do with the evolutionary dynamics of the Aryans. And this takes in because the problem with the model I just proposed is, well, why is it that there was a time when civilization was based in Greece or Rome further south? I suspect the reason for that might have been that Britain was more up against it than those places, and therefore less able to innovate things and less able to take risks. But once the brilliant things that were innovated further south, like farming or whatever, came there, then those people that were more intelligent were able to really go for it with those. But I'm not sure. Another model is that it's to do with Aryans, and that most places you just have a dominant male, despotism, he's in charge, that's that. And for some reason, they come up with this strategy of a group of aristocrats who would sort of cooperate to be in charge. And this selected in favor of individuals, genius types, perhaps we could say, being allowed to gain incredible status independent of the king. Being more individualistic, and therefore this is the Aryan thing. This is the problem with that. It strikes me is that well, what's the part of Europe that has the most Aryan genes? What is it? Ireland, and the part of Europe that has very few or Indo-European is like Greece. So I don't see how it's in Italy. I'm not sure how that works. So I think my Goldilocks zone idea is better.
Okay. What would you advise to young Western men regarding women? All the women I know are feminists and only care about their career. Waste of time, if you ask me, trying it on with them.
Yeah, go to church. Go to church. That's where the good girls go. And not a left-wing church, a conservative church.
Nice advice. Traditional Catholic Church, for example.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah. My last question was, we spoke about progressivism as a religion a couple of minutes ago, and I wanted to ask you, how do you define religion in the terms of evolutionary psychology?
Well, I would see that we have a bundle of different adaptations, like obeying the leader and over-detecting agency and all these kinds of things. And because they're all adaptive, they become bundled together. They become pleiotripically selected together into this one thing, which we call religiousness, which is it's something like the collective worship of a moral God or something like that. And that, because it is adaptive to do that, because it reduces neuroticism, because you know that everything's going to be okay, because It elevates agreeableness, that you feel that you're being watched, and therefore you're less likely to be cast out by the band. And therefore, this becomes associated with other things that are adaptive, like patriarchy or ethnocentrism or whatever. And they all become They all become related together, and then at health and everything, and they all become related together. And that's what seems to have happened. And that's why religiousness seems to be associated even now with mental and physical health. And so that's how I would see the development of religiousness. And as the selection pressures have weakened, what seems to be happening is that bundle that is religiousness seems to be, and you see this, by the way, in more primitive environments where there are weaker selection pressures, the nature of religion is a bit different. So cooperation and whatever is less important in an easy environment where food grows on trees all year round. You don't have to survive in the winter. And there you find that they don't have moral gods. They just have ancestors. And they don't really do much worshipping of them either. They just occasionally sort of say thank you to them or whatever. And it's only the religiousness becomes selected for concomitantly with intelligence, it seems, once you get farming, and then in particular once you get city-states, where you have these strangers. That's also the group-level selection for religiousness. You promote positive and negative ethnocentrism as the will of God, and you have these strangers you have to cooperate with. How do you do that? Well, if they have the same God as you, you can trust them. It's like an insurance policy, and so religiousness develops from there. So I think that's how it's come about. And I think that when the selection pressures weaken, then these things come apart. And so you start to get forms of religiousness which are maladaptive, such as that preach that the world is run by Satan and you should kill yourself, which you kind of got with Gnosticism in the Roman warm period, and you get with these conspiracy theory type things or whatever, like a BLM now. They take aspects of religiousness, only aspects of them, but in some ways the most maladaptive ones, and people have only those, and those people will die out. So I think that's kind of what's going on, even in evolutionary psychological terms.
One last question: is it possible to view at homosexuality as an evolutionary strategy, or as a maladaptive evolutionary strategy?
It's hard to say. I did a paper on this. I think that it's possible. The heritability of male homosexuality is quite high. It's about 0.4. It's a universal. So it makes you wonder if it might. Then why is it kept in the population? And you get it in all populations. Why? And that makes one wonder if there might be some adaptive dimension to it. One thing that's noticeable is in all cultures, priests seem to be more likely to be gay, and gay people are more likely to be religious, gay men. So and indeed religious people have a more feminine intelligence profile than non-religious people. And so what could be going on is that it's adaptive for a society to have a very small number of people who are gay, and then they, because homosexuality is not allowed, are pushed into group-oriented positions. So the energy which they would put into having gay sex or whatever is forced into being group selected. And this might be why there is evidence that a lot of geniuses are gay. What do geniuses do? They are group selected. They do something brilliant for the society, new weapon or something, so it dominates other societies. Priests inspire the society with greater religiosity and therefore greater ethnocentrism, and therefore winning the battle of group selection. So it could be that at the group level, a moderately small level of gayness is a good thing. And that's one of the reasons why homosexuality would stay in the population. Another theory is that women sexually select for not the alpha male, like in in more cold, difficult ecologies. They want men that are cooperative, that won't just pump and dump. And so those men will have some sort of feminine qualities. And so the result of that is by just genetic chance, you'll get outliers that will have too many feminine qualities, and they will be gay. So that could be why it stays in the population. It's adaptive indirectly for that reason. Another possibility is that a group needs to avoid intramale conflict. It's good to have you are fighting other groups. So it's no good if your men are fighting each other. If you have too many men, then of course, in a polygamous society, which is what we've been for most of our history, you're going to have all this fighting over the women. So that's no good. So if those people, if too many men, they're gay, then you have less of a problem, and that would be consistent with a birth order effect on homosexuality. So the more sons a woman has, the more likely the younger son is to be gay. So that would also be relevant. The other thing I'd note is that when we talk about it's a small, consistent with the idea that it's genetically good to have a small percentage of the population that are gay, these gays that are priests or whatever, they to the extent that they break with their vows and they start buggering choir boys, it is them doing the buggering. They are, as it were, tops, and it is the gays that are bottoms that have much higher levels of mental and physical illness. So it could be that the growth of gayness is a growth of bottoms, and there is actually a study on this, and that the bottoms are a result of decreasing Darwinian selection pressure.
I wanted to tell this one thing because I had a girlfriend. I didn't quite understand what she wanted to tell me. I was considering myself religious or whatever this means, but she'd always tell me that I'm not religious, that I'm only into it with my mind, that I'm only into it for the religiosity, but that I don't have faith. This is probably somehow connected to what you've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, is it?
Was she a Protestant?
No, she was a Catholic, but a modern Catholic, a modernistic Catholic.
I don't know. I mean, she could be distinguishing between those who are very, very fervently religious and those that are just kind of more like what you get in pagan countries, Hinduism or Shinto or whatever, where it's just about rituals and doing what the ancestors did. And there are these two kinds of religion: the religion that William James highlights, the religion of healthy mindedness, which yes, there's religious belief, but often it just seems to be about rituals and things, and the religion of the sick soul, which is where you're high neuroticism, which women are compared to men, and therefore they deal with this by being extremely fervently religious and really strongly believing in God. And so there is perhaps that difference, and that might have been what she was getting at.
Yeah, what I speculated was that she meant that faith means having a mystical personal relationship with God.
Well, yeah, if you're high in neuroticism, then you're more likely to have religious experiences, because the religious experiences reduce your neuroticism. And it's been found that, I think that's what was going on with BLM and whatever, and even with QAnon. You had a time of mortality salience. Mortality salience elevates religious feelings. But the religion that people have been inculcated with, a lot of them, was either multiculturalism or weird conspiracy theories. And so that was what the religious revival was. Whereas when you had a period of mortality salience from World War II, in the wake of that, in the West, you had just a traditional religious revival, Billy Graham and things like that. So I think what we were having was it's died down now, but I think what we were having was a religious revival.
Okay, Professor Dutton, thanks for stopping by. Thanks for accepting my invitation. I hope we can see each other soon again. Good luck. Have a nice day and nice evening, and good night to all of the viewers. Thanks for all the comments. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.